The year was 1887, and the land held its breath. Arthur Blackwood felt it in the hollow of his own chest, a stillness that had settled in his bones 3 winters ago and never quite left. His ranch was a lonely island carved into the foothills of the mountains, a place where the wind spoke more often than he did. The silence in his cabin was a physical thing, thick with the ghosts of laughter and a child's small questions. He lived with the precise, monotonous rhythm of chores, each swing of the axe and turn of the soil a penance for the crime of surviving when his wife, Martha, and their son, Daniel, had not. Grief, Arthur had learned, had weight. It was in the woolen blanket on the empty side of his bed, in the small, scuffed boots he could not bring himself to discard. It had hardened him, hammered his compassion into a shield of stoic indifference. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts: work, eat, sleep. The nearby town of Redemption was a place he visited only when necessity demanded, a place of too many pitying glances and clumsy condolences that felt like stones thrown at a fresh wound. He preferred the company of his cattle, their demands simple and their judgments non-existent. His property was marked by a creek that tumbled down from the high peaks, its water cold enough to ache in the teeth even in the height of summer. It was his boundary line, a liquid fence between his solitary world and whatever lay beyond. On a sweltering August afternoon, with the sun beating down on the parched earth, he headed there to fill his water buckets. The familiar creak of the leather handles a dull counterpoint to the drone of insects. But as he neared the line of willows that fringed the bank, a sound broke the day's placid monotony. A splash. Not the frantic thrashing of a deer, but something softer, more deliberate. He froze, his hand tightening on the bucket handle. Trespassers were rare, but not unheard of. He moved with a woodsman's quiet, parting the willow branches with a slow, careful hand. And then he saw her. A woman was in the middle of the creek, the water swirling around her shoulders. Her back was to him, her skin pale against the dark, rushing water. Her hair, a mass of tangled brown, was piled atop her head. She moved with a weariness that was visible even from a distance, her arms scrubbing at her skin as if trying to wash away more than just trail dust. On the bank, a pathetic bundle of clothes lay discarded, worn and ripped beyond simple mending. Arthur felt a spike of anger, hot and territorial. This was his land, his water, his solitude. He opened his mouth to shout, to order her off, but the sound caught in his throat. He saw the sharp angle of her shoulder blades, the gauntness that spoke of missed meals and hard miles. He saw a dark, ugly bruise blooming across her left shoulder, a mar on the pale canvas of her skin. The sight muted his anger, replacing it with something unwelcome and complicated. He saw not an intruder, but a creature cornered and exhausted. He stayed hidden, a silent observer in his own domain. When she finally turned, dipping her head to rinse her hair, he saw her face. It was a face of sharp, delicate bones, currently hollowed out by fatigue and hunger, but one that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. He watched her for a long moment, his mind a turmoil of conflicting impulses. The rancher in him wanted her gone. The man he used to be, the man who had been Martha's husband, felt a reluctant stirring of pity. She began to wade toward the bank, her movements slow and pained. He saw her flinch as she put weight on her left foot. Finally, he stepped out from behind the willows. He did not speak, merely let his presence be known. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a wild, animal terror. She scrambled for the bank, clutching at her worn chemise to cover herself, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Fear, stark and absolute, radiated from her. She looked like a doe that had just scented a wolf. "This is private land," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It was not the angry shout he had intended, but a flat statement of fact. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw the water. I didn't mean no harm. I'll be going." She tried to stand, to gather her ragged clothes, but she winced and sank back, her hand going to her ankle. Arthur looked from her frightened face to her bruised shoulder to the slight limp she was trying to hide. He thought of the empty barn, the surplus of dried beans in his larder. He thought of Martha, who would have already been down here with a blanket and a kind word. The thought was a sharp pang of guilt. Against every instinct for self-preservation and isolation he had cultivated for 3 years, he let out a heavy sigh. "The sun will be down in an hour," he said, his tone still gruff. "There's a storm coming from the west. You can take shelter in the barn for the night, but you're to be gone by sunrise." He turned and walked away before she could answer, before he could change his mind. He did not look back, but he could feel her stunned, wary gaze on him all the way back to the cabin. That night, the storm broke with a fury, the wind howling like a thing grieving, and Arthur lay awake, listening to the rain on the roof, acutely aware of the stranger's presence disturbing the perfect, painful equilibrium of his solitude. The next morning the world was washed clean. The air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. True to his word, Arthur expected the woman to be gone. Still, a nagging sense of duty, a vestige of the man he once was, compelled him to check. He brewed coffee, the aroma filling the silent cabin, and poured a second cup into a tin mug. He found a biscuit left over from the day before and carried both out to the barn. He found her not inside, but perched on the top rail of the corral fence, staring out at the mountains. She had managed to wash and mend her dress, the crude stitches a testament to her desperation. The morning light caught her face, now scrubbed clean of grime. It was then, in that clear, unforgiving light, that the recognition struck him. It hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He had seen that face before, weeks ago, on his last trip into redemption for salt and flour. It had been tacked to the sheriff's notice board, a stark charcoal sketch on a piece of paper that fluttered in the breeze. The cheekbones, the shape of the eyes, the small scar just above her eyebrow. It was her. Clara Hale, wanted, accomplice to the outlaw Garrison Vance in the robbery of a stagecoach near Willow Creek. Reward, $200. The tin mug in his hand suddenly felt heavy. $200. It was a fortune. It could buy a new bull, repair the leaking roof of the barn, see him through the next 2 winters with ease. It was a solution, a clean and simple end to a problem he hadn't asked for. All he had to do was ride to town. She turned then, sensing his approach. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were filled with a wary gratitude. She had not bolted, she had stayed, as if awaiting his judgment. "Thank you," she said softly, her gaze dropping to the coffee he held out. "For the shelter." He said nothing. He just stared at her, the wanted poster burned into his mind's eye. He saw the sketch, and then he saw the woman before him. The poster hadn't shown the exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. It hadn't captured the fear that lived deep in her eyes. And as she shifted her position on the fence, pulling her thin dress tighter against a sudden morning chill, he saw something else the poster had most certainly omitted, a gentle, unmistakable swell to her abdomen. She was pregnant. The knowledge landed in the silent space between them, changing everything. $200. His mind reeled. He could turn her in, a pregnant woman, and collect the blood money. He imagined the smirking satisfaction of the bounty hunters, the cold justice of a cell. He looked at her, and for a fleeting, terrible moment, he didn't see a criminal. He saw Martha, in the early days of her own pregnancy with Daniel, her face full of a fragile, fierce hope. The comparison was a knife to the heart. He felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it almost buckled his knees. "I know who you are," he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet morning. The fragile gratitude in her face shattered, replaced instantly by the same raw terror he'd seen at the creek. She slid off the fence, stumbling back, her hands instinctively going to her belly in a gesture of primal protection. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's not what they say. I didn't. I wouldn't." He held up a hand, not in threat, but to stop the torrent of panicked words. He set the mug of coffee and the biscuit on the fence post between them. A chasm of silence opened up. He could hear the lowing of his cattle in the pasture, the distant caw of a raven. His entire world had been upended by this fugitive woman and the secret she carried. The simple path turning her in now seemed like a betrayal of something he couldn't name. A betrayal of Martha's memory, perhaps, or a betrayal of some last buried piece of his own humanity. "The coffee will get cold," he said, his voice flat. He turned his back on her and the $200 she represented and walked toward the woodpile, the handle of his axe feeling solid and real in a world that had suddenly become unstable. For now he had made a choice. He didn't know if it was the right one, but it was the only one he could live with. For now, she would stay. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Arthur did not mention the wanted poster again, and Clara did not offer any further explanations. Her presence was a quiet weight in his solitary world. He gave her the small room that had been Daniel's, a space he had kept locked for 3 years. Unlocking that door felt like breaking a rib, a sharp, internal pain, but he did it. He watched as she cleaned the small room, her hands gentle as she wiped dust from the little wooden horse he had carved for his son. He put her to work, not out of cruelty, but because idleness felt dangerous, a breeding ground for the questions that hung between them. She tended the small vegetable garden Martha had planted, her movements slow and careful. She mended his work shirts, her stitches far neater than his own clumsy attempts. They ate their meals in silence at the rough-hewn table, the space between them charged with a tension that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to ease. He found himself watching her. He saw the way she would pause in her weeding, her hand resting on her belly, a look of profound and troubled love on her face. He saw the deep weariness in her that sleep never seemed to fully erase. She was little more than a girl, he realized, thrust into a world far too harsh for her. One evening, as a bruised twilight settled over the valley, she spoke. "His name was Garrison Vance," she said to the table, not looking at him. "The man I was with." Arthur stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth. He waited. "He was handsome, charming. He promised me a different life." Her voice was low, laced with a shame that was painful to hear, but his charm was a mask. Underneath he was cruel, the robbery. "I didn't know what he was planning. I was just there. When it happened, when the shooting started, I ran. I've been running ever since." He listened, his own silence an invitation for her to continue. He saw the truth of her words in the tremor of her hands, in the haunted look in her eyes. "He said he loved me," she whispered, "but love isn't supposed to leave marks." She unconsciously touched her shoulder, where the bruise had faded to a sickly yellow-green. In that moment, the last of his judgment withered away. He saw her not as a criminal, but as a survivor, and something in him, some long-frozen part of his heart, began to thaw. "My wife's name was Martha," he heard himself say, the words feeling strange and foreign on his tongue. "My boy was Daniel. The fever took them in the winter of 1884. It was the first time he had spoken their names to another soul in years. The admission hung in the air, a fragile bridge built between two wounded people. Clara finally looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't offer pity or platitudes. She just gave him a small, sad nod of understanding. It was more comfort than he had received in 3 years of well-meaning condolences. From that day on, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but of companionship. He found himself telling her about Daniel's fascination with frogs, about the way Martha's apple pie could make even the coldest winter day feel warm. In return, she told him about her childhood on a poor farm in Ohio, about her dream of one day seeing the ocean. They were two solitary ghosts, slowly learning to haunt the same space together. He was beginning to realize he wasn't just sheltering a fugitive, he was sheltering a fragile hope, and in doing so, he was beginning to heal himself. The quiet peace they had cultivated was too fragile to last. Arthur knew this, felt it like the promise of an early frost in the air. The world did not simply forget a woman with a price on her head. The first sign of trouble came in the form of Sheriff McBride, a grizzled man with kind eyes who had known Arthur since he was a boy. He rode out one afternoon, his horse kicking up dust along the path to the cabin. Arthur's heart seized. He met the sheriff on the porch, positioning himself to block the doorway where Clara had been kneading dough. "Arthur," McBride said, tipping his hat. He didn't dismount. "Just making my rounds. Wanted to give you a heads up. There's a bounty hunter in town, a man named Shaw, asking a lot of questions." Arthur kept his face a mask of neutrality. "What kind of questions?" "About strangers, drifters, anyone passing through who might not want to be found," the sheriff said, his gaze shrewd. He glanced past Arthur for a fraction of a second, just long enough to see a flicker of movement inside the cabin, before returning his eyes to Arthur's. "He's particularly interested in a woman named Hale, from that stagecoach business over at Willow Creek." "Haven't seen anyone," Arthur said, the lie feeling thick and clumsy in his mouth. Sheriff McBride held his gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. The sheriff had known Martha. He had stood by Arthur at the graveside. He saw the change in Arthur now. The hard shell was still there, but some of the profound, deathly stillness had gone from his eyes. "Well," McBride said finally, gathering his reins, "you keep to yourself out here, I know, but if you happen to see anything, Shaw is a hard man, not one for subtleties. You take care, Arthur." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread hanging in the air. Arthur went back inside. Clara stood by the table, her hands covered in flour, her face pale as a ghost. She had heard everything. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows something's different," Arthur corrected her, his voice grim. "And he's warning me. That bounty hunter, if he comes out here." The unspoken threat hung between them. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. Every hoofbeat in the distance, every snap of a twig in the woods, became a source of heart, stopping anxiety. The stakes had been raised. It was no longer just Clara's freedom on the line, but Arthur's as well. He was harboring a fugitive. He was an accomplice. But as he looked at her, at the fear warring with a new, fierce determination in her eyes, he felt no regret. His protective instinct, dormant for so long, was now a roaring fire. This woman, this child she carried, had stumbled into his life and given it a purpose beyond mere survival. He had been living in a tomb of his own making, and she had inadvertently led him back into the world of the living, a world fraught with danger and consequence. He started checking the loads in his rifle every morning. He slept with a shotgun by his bed. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a guardian. The arrival of Garrison Vance was not subtle. He came at dusk, when the shadows were long and treacherous, making the world a canvas of grey and black. He didn't use the main path, but came up from the creek, a dark figure materializing from the trees like an ill omen. Arthur saw him from the barn, a flicker of movement where none should be. It wasn't the bounty hunter, Shaw. This man moved with an arrogant, predatory stride. Arthur's blood ran cold. He knew, instinctively, who it was. He grabbed a heavy pitchfork, its tines gleaming dully in the fading light, and moved to intercept him before he reached the cabin, where Clara was preparing their evening meal. "That's far enough," Arthur called out, his voice a low growl. Vance stopped, a silhouette against the darkening sky. He was tall and lean, with a cruel twist to his mouth that was visible even from 20 yards away. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me," he said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. "She came this way. I've been tracking her for weeks." "There's nothing for you here," Arthur said, gripping the pitchfork tighter. "Turn around and ride out." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You think you can stop me, old man? She's mine. Her and the brat she's carrying. I've come to collect." He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the pistol holstered at his hip. From the cabin, the door creaked open. Clara stood framed in the yellow lamplight, her face a mask of utter horror. "Garrison," she breathed. "There you are, my love," Vance sneered, his eyes fixing on her, "hiding behind some farmer. Did you really think you could get away?" That was all the distraction Arthur needed. He didn't wait for Vance to draw. He lunged, not with the finesse of a gunfighter, but with the raw, desperate power of a man defending his home. He drove the pitchfork forward, aiming not to kill, but to disarm. Vance, surprised by the sudden, furious assault, jumped back, his pistol clearing the holster a second too late. The steel tines of the fork snagged the gun belt, ripping it from his waist. The pistol flew through the air, landing in the dust. Vance roared in fury and charged, discarding stealth for brute force. The two men crashed together in the yard. It was not a fight of skill, but a brutal, grunting struggle for dominance. Vance was younger, quicker, his fists landing with vicious precision. Arthur was stronger, his muscles hardened by years of labor. He took a blow to the jaw that sent stars exploding behind his eyes, but he wrapped his arms around Vance, lifting him and slamming him against the side of the water trough. The wood groaned under the impact. They grappled in the dirt, dust choking the air. Vance was like an eel, wiry and strong. He got a hand free and scrabbled for a rock. Just as he raised it to bring it down on Arthur's head, a blur of motion came from the porch. Clara, her face streaked with tears but set with a ferocious resolve, swung a heavy piece of firewood with all her might. It connected with Vance's shoulder with a sickening thud. He screamed in pain, his arm going limp, the rock falling from his grasp. The momentary lapse was the only opening Arthur needed. He scrambled on top of Vance, his hands finding the man's throat, not to choke him, but to hold him down. He pinned him to the earth, his knee pressing into the injured shoulder until Vance cried out in submission. It was over. Arthur knelt over the panting, defeated man, his own breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. Clara stood nearby, the piece of firewood held like a weapon, her body trembling but her spirit unbroken. And it was into this tableau of violent aftermath that a third man walked. He came around the corner of the barn, a rifle held loosely in his hands, his eyes taking in the scene with a cold, professional assessment. He was a hard-faced man with a drooping mustache. "Well now, the bounty hunter, Shaw," said, his voice calm. "Looks like I missed the party." He looked from the bound Vance on the ground to Clara, then to Arthur. His eyes lingered on Clara's face, then on the wanted poster he pulled from his coat pocket. He compared the two. "Clara Hale, I presume." Arthur got slowly to his feet, placing himself between Shaw and Clara. "The man on the ground is Garrison Vance," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "He's wanted for the Willow Creek robbery. He came here to take her. He was beating her. She ran from him. She's carrying his child." Shaw's gaze was unreadable. He looked at Vance, who was glaring up at him with pure hatred. Then he looked at Clara, who met his eyes not with fear, but with a weary defiance. He saw her condition, saw the fading bruises on her arms, saw the protective way Arthur stood before her. He looked down at the poster in his hand, then back at the man on the ground. The reward for Vance was $500, more than double the price on the woman. He was a businessman, not a crusader. "Seems to me," Shaw said slowly, holstering his rifle, "I found the outlaw Garrison Vance trying to rob an isolated ranch. This brave farmer fought him off. As for the woman," he crumpled the poster for Clara in his fist, "must have been a misidentification. The woman I saw on that poster didn't look anything like this lady here." He gestured with his chin towards Vance. "I'll be taking him off your hands." "The law will want to thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Arthur supplied, a wave of profound relief washing over him. "Mr. Blackwood," Shaw repeated with a nod. He hauled a struggling Vance to his feet, binding his hands with a practiced efficiency. "You two have a quiet evening." He dragged his bounty away into the darkness, leaving Arthur and Clara standing alone in the silent yard, the echoes of violence slowly fading into the vast, peaceful quiet of the mountains. The threat was gone. They were safe. The seasons turned. The harshness of autumn bled into the deep, isolating white of winter. But this winter, the cabin was not a cold, silent tomb. It was filled with the soft sounds of life, the crackle of the fire, the quiet hum of Clara singing to herself, the steady, reassuring presence of another heartbeat in the house. The shared terror of that evening had burned away the last of their reservations, forging a bond of trust and reliance that was stronger than any legal document or spoken vow. The silence between them was now one of comfort, of shared understanding that required no words. He would watch her knit small garments by the fire, her belly growing with the promise of new life, and a feeling of profound contentment would settle in his chest. It was a feeling he thought had been buried forever with Martha and Daniel. He had been wrong. When the snows finally began to melt and the first green shoots of spring pushed through the sodden earth, Clara's time came. It was a long, difficult night, but Arthur was there. He held her hand, wiped her brow with a cool cloth, and whispered words of encouragement, his voice steady and calm. He followed her instructions, his hands, once used to the rough work of the ranch, now surprisingly gentle as he helped bring a new life into the world. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, the cabin was filled with a new sound, the lusty cry of a healthy baby girl. Clara lay back against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, the tiny, bundled infant cradled in her arms. She looked at Arthur, her eyes full of a gratitude so deep it needed no expression. He looked at the child, at her perfect miniature features, and felt a love so fierce and protective it staggered him. It was not a love that replaced what he had lost, but one that grew alongside it, healing the scarred landscape of his heart. Weeks later, he stood on the porch, watching Clara rock their daughter in the warm afternoon sun. The ranch, once his prison of grief, was now a sanctuary. The land, once a reflection of his harsh, unforgiving sorrow, now seemed to hold a gentle promise. He had found a woman bathing in his creek, a fugitive with a price on her head, and in an act of reluctant mercy, he had found his own redemption. He had not sought it, had not believed it possible, but life, in its strange and unpredictable way, had brought him a new family. He walked over and sat beside her on the porch swing. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, and the baby made a soft, contented sound in her sleep. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. In the quiet rhythm of the swinging porch, under the vast, open sky, they had built a new world. They had found a home, not on a map or a deed, but in the shelter they provided for one another. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Blackwood felt truly, completely at peace.